This Commission recommended to the Executive Board to enter into a targeted dialogue with Brisbane 2032 and the Australian Olympic Committee for the Games of the 35th Olympiad.
With no fanfare, a low-key IOC announcement by President Thomas Bach, the 2032 Olympics have effectively been awarded to Brisbane. It was an unexpected moment of the week and Queensland Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk was delighted.
It's a new norm, which means it's a game changer. We don't have to build huge stadiums that are not going to be used in the future.
But why was the usual bidding contest scrapped and Olympic host nominated without the dramatic contested elections we're all familiar with? We'll analyse that and talk through the rest of the week's sports news on this edition of Sport Unlocked. Hello and welcome to the podcast analysing the biggest sports news issues in the week ending February 26, 2021. I'm Rob Harris, and alongside me as ever on Sport Unlocked is Martyn Ziegler at the end of a week when there were finally some developments on the lifting of lockdown in England and some encouraging news for sport.
Yes, I mean, in terms of the return of fans, very interesting news. It's going to be May the 17th, which obviously is in time for the Euros and potentially having fans back for the last weekend of the Premier League season.
And also back alongside us this week is Tariq Panja. You excited to see stadiums getting full again?
Absolutely. It's a return to normalcy. Also excited and surprised to join you guys again. Another week with you two, locked in our homes.
So Ziggs, when do you think the first moment is we will get the fans back in the stadiums? Although they announced May, there is a potential that we could have some fans back in April, isn't there?
Yeah, so they announced a research programme the government did, which will start in mid-April, and that is going to have pilot events with a smaller number. So it's 10,000 fans after May the 17th. Before that, the pilot events are potentially smaller numbers than that. So I think there'll be various sports looking into pitching to have their particular matches, planning for and working out how fans can return safely. And I think the FA Cup final and the Carabao Cup final, they're going to both of those are going to be pitched for to have some fans back in, that's for sure.
Because the thing that I suppose is still a bit confusing is whether after the June date when all social restrictions are eased, stadiums can be automatically full, or whether it's going to require still some sort of testing or proof of vaccination before they can be completely at capacity, as in what will it take for the finals of the Euros, the semis and the final at least at Wembley to have 90,000 packed seats. It's not automatic, is it?
No, it's not. So June the 21st is the earliest that all restrictions can be lifted. But if you speak to people in the government, they think it's very unlikely that at Wimbledon, tennis, at the Euros, that you're going to have capacity straight away. Things may change completely if the vaccine proves incredible, but the plan at the moment is to try and ease the restrictions. So, for example, you might have Wembley half full, 45,000, and UEFA actually would be absolutely delighted with that, because from where things were looking a few weeks ago, they would bite their hand off to get that.
And Tariq, we had yet more discussion this week about what will happen to the Euros, and from an unlikely source, perhaps suggesting the format might change.
Yeah, someone sent Twitter on a frenzy, which it doesn't seem that hard to do these days, does it? But yeah, saying that the entire tournament will be played in England. That was news to people at UEFA, because as far as they're concerned, at this moment in time, at the time you're recording this podcast, which is all we can go on, it's still going to be in the 12 cities as planned. And I suppose they're kind of used to that now as well, because we've had Europa League and Champions League taking place throughout this season all over Europe, and it's largely been trouble-free. Even recently, where home teams have been unable to host their matches, we've seen most of the Premier League teams playing their home and away games in different parts of Europe, and it seems to have worked from an operational point of view. It has obviously upset people in the sense of away goals and technical issues like that, but it can be hosted, and I think UEFA are comfortable, so maybe we all have err on the side of calm, wait for the news as it develops. And look, who knows? It might be in England, it might be in 12 cities, but at the moment it's 12 cities. It might be elsewhere. I think right now, during the pandemic, I think the lesson we've learned is, can we just sort of chill out a little bit and wait and see what happens?
And what we've seen is all the flexibility in terms of moving moving Europa League games, Champions League games. But the way France-Scotland Six Nations game had to be postponed because of the outbreak in the France squad is a reminder, actually, that on the continent, the situation is not improving necessarily in the way it is in England at the moment, with cases coming down and the vaccination programme. So there's a different pace of the rollout of the vaccine in Europe, and in terms of where they are in the second wave as well, which could influence what happens with the Euros hosting decision, which doesn't look like anything will be final until April.
Yeah, that's right. So what do you guys think about this passport business? Do you think with more people being vaccinated, etc., in terms of opening up and maybe increasing capacity, do you think there is a possibility? They were talking about nightclubs, but what about sports arenas with a passport?
I think there's some serious questions around that, about whether it's discriminatory to have a vaccine passport. I mean, there are some parts. I was reading something about parts of London where the take-up of the vaccination is as low as 1 in 10, due to the fact a lot of the communities perhaps don't understand. English isn't their first language. They don't understand what's happening, or that the messages aren't getting through somehow. And so actually, if you're saying you can only come in if you have a vaccination passport, I think that's quite a serious thing to say to somebody in terms of human rights. So I'm not sure that will happen. But I know some countries are going down that route in a big way. So maybe I'm wrong. There are some people who don't like vaccines, aren't there? I mean, the whole MMR debate. I mean, most people think that was, people who are anti-vaccines are a sort of a minority cult almost, but they still have their rights. And are you saying that they should be discriminated against? They can't watch a football match just because they disagree with having a vaccine themselves?
It's a good question, though, isn't it? I mean, in terms of this pandemic, it's something we've not lived through. I guess if we all decided we didn't want a vaccine because it's something I disagree with, how do you open anything up?
Well, of course, we had the intervention from a potential podcast listener, the Queen, in urging people to get the vaccine this week and to think about others in doing so.
Why do you say potential?
It's not been ruled out as far as we know. We probably need to check on with the palace if she is, but it is available to her to listen to. And I'm sure if there's one member of the family who could be listening, it's the IOC member in her family, Princess Anne, who would normally have a vote on where the Olympics goes. But this time round for 2032, the decision seems to have been taken behind the scenes out of her hands. This
is a change to the whole election process for Olympic cities, which was brought in a couple of years ago. And from what I can see, I mean, it seems to hand all the power to the president of the IOC, Thomas Bach, and his close allies, because Queensland has been identified as the priority host city, or the favoured choice. I mean, I'm sure it'll have to be rubber stamped by the whole IOC. But there's, to me, so many questions why you're sort of taking the whole transparency out of the whole process and letting 100 odd IOC members vote on 5 or 6 different cities. This seems to be completely at odds with what's happening at FIFA, which has just changed to allow 211 countries to all vote on the Men's World Cup hosts. And yet we have the IOC choosing their preferred city based on a working group headed by John Coates, the Australian, close ally of Thomas Bach, who effectively seems to have chosen his own country's city, which, I mean, it just seems almost incredible to me.
This is the thing that, between Olympics, that sports fans can see, the visibility of the IOC is the bidding contest, the excitement, the envelope reveal, the drama of who's going to host the Olympics. And that open democratic process seems to have just completely vanished now and been replaced by this behind-the-scenes negotiations, the like we used to normally in Formula One with Bernie Ecclestone in the past, just going round venues and seeing who works for him in terms of a host city. And, basically this seems to deny the opportunity for any other countries to be part of an open bidding process.
Yeah, Ziggs, you said it seems incredible, but it doesn't, does it? It's so in keeping with how these sports organisations are run. It's another example of conflicts of interest galore at the top of major sports institutions. I mean, John Coates is a very interesting figure. 30 years the head of the Australian Olympic Committee. Is that normal? 30 years for someone to be in charge of an organisation like that? Should it be normal? And then, John Coates also on top of the Court of Arbitration for Sport, which is funded in many ways by the IOC, which rules on many cases involving the IOC. John Coates, again, being put in charge of this panel for future Olympic hosts, knowing full well that John Coates' other hat, the Australian Olympic Committee, might be putting a bidder through, and it did with Queensland here. It just screams perhaps cronyism and a small group of people having way too much power at the top of sports. And maybe all of this was done fairly and squarely, but it's what it shows, isn't it? It's the perception of all of the things that are wrong, I guess, with how sports is governed today. We talk about it pretty much every week on this thing. Here's another example. Maybe Queensland, if it was a bidding competition, would have had the best bid anyway and would have won the process. But my point is, if Queensland was going to be in this race, why is John Coates involved in formulating the kind of arrangements that lead to his own bid being picked? It's a question. It's a question that the German bidders, I think there was at least one bid from Germany. Some ministers have spoken up about a lack of transparency, etc. And again, it's the IOC's image that is smashed again, isn't it? As it is FIFA from time to time because of things like this.
And FIFA, the ones who, as we mentioned, seem to have cleaned up their process. The fact they've opened out the voting to the whole membership, all national associations, the bidding process, you get all the published documents now on the assessment scored of the host venues and human rights, environmental policies as well. And like we did with the 2026 World Cup bidding, we can look at where Morocco fails, we can look at the challenges in North America, and they're all laid out. And then you can see as they reach the conclusion, whereas now, we don't know what's gone on behind the scenes clearly in terms of reaching Brisbane. And also it means that the Middle East loses out once again. There's no Middle East bid. There's no African bid. Not that the one mooted, but it means the Olympics has never been staged on those two continents. The rings feature in the logo. Doha had been bidding, or certainly been interested in a bid. But probably what it helps the IOC avoid is, of course, the rights questions over somewhere like Qatar and staging a World Cup there, and the fact they managed to have what seems like a simpler bidding, a simpler host in terms of they're saying 14 venues are already in place in Brisbane. They're dealing with a democratic country as well.
There is a devil's advocate with the bidding competitions up into Tokyo 2020, Rio 2016. Have been marred with corruption allegations as well. When you have a bidding contest, often you run the risk of some murky behaviour, shall we say, taking place behind the scenes that lead to decisions. There is an open investigation into Tokyo 2020, and the leaders of Rio 2016 have been charged, and I think awaiting trial for allegedly paying bribes to African officials to gather those votes. I guess in one sense, the IOC is maybe clearing the decks and preventing something like that from happening.
I'm sure that's part of the reason, because it's embarrassing for the IOC, and they've looked at ways they can lessen the embarrassment risk to them from all these things. And I mean, talking of John Coates, I mean, when you're as long in the tooth as me, when I first started working in sports news and all the IOC corruption inquiry around Salt Lake City, it actually emerged in 1999 that John Coates had paid two African countries something like $40,000 as what he called a gesture of goodwill. Actually, it was $70,000, and it was on the eve of the vote. This money was made, and I mean, at the time, questions were raised. I think it was decided it wasn't a bribe, but it was a gesture of goodwill. But this is the guy. He's still there now, isn't he? And he's still calling the shots.
Well, let's hear again from the IOC President Thomas Bach, who held a press conference after designating preferred bidder status on Australia for the 2032 Olympics. And my AP colleague Graham Dunbar asked about the role of John Coates in this whole process, which is leading to Brisbane following Paris and Los Angeles as Olympic Summer Games hosts.
A question about good governance and the perception that a new process for bidding has sort of immediately rewarded the IOC official who's most closely identified with shaping the process in its creation. And there has been off and on over the last decade of the wisdom of having IOC vice presidents running WADA and CAS, and the perception for those, the reputation of those organisations, even given all the consultation you've done with the UN and the World Bank. Do you have any concerns about this sort of perception of whether you're meeting best practice governance standards for an international organisation in sport?
Mr. Coates has not taken part in any kind of discussion of the IOC Executive Board concerning the reports of the future host commission, or related directly or indirectly to the Olympic Games 2032. And all this is supervised, by our compliance department, who at the beginning of every meeting is clearly explaining which member of the IOC Executive Board is conflicted with regard to different interests, and is therefore excluded from the concerning discussions.
Well, just as Australia will now face no opposition for the 2032 Olympics, Thomas Bach is running unopposed for re-election as IOC President in March. He will receive another 4-year term. He was first elected in 2013. But for many sports fans, even though he's one of the most powerful figures in world sport, so many probably won't be even familiar with him.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think Tariq and I were at Buenos Aires at the IOC Commission when he was elected. A former international fencer, but as you say, he's a bit of a sort of faceless character. I'm sure if you went to most people in the street and asked who the head of the Olympic Committee was, they would have no idea. They would probably say it was Seb Coe. But but he's somebody who's I think when he was elected, at the time there was sort of people thought he was a sort of safe pair of hands. But actually what it's turned out is that he has drawn a lot of criticism for being basically protecting his own interests in many ways, not dealing with issues like the Tokyo bribery. I would say he certainly hasn't been inspirational.
He plays the grey man really well. Like, you could be in a room full of suits and he'd be another one, and you just walk past him. And he also strikes me as a bit of an old school character, particularly, you said, he was an Olympian, yes, fencing, but he's also from the horse dazzler school. So that's really, really old school. This is kind of the way these sports organisations are structured today. It owes a lot to the former Adidas man, Horst Dassler, and his marketing strategies. Bach was one of those guys, and he very much is a politician hewn from the same rock as the Havelanges of the past, as the Samaranches, etc. He knows the machine inside out, and I guess he pulls the strings from inside the multi-million-dollar lakeside headquarters of Lausanne. Building a team of loyal lieutenants around him. We mentioned John Coates earlier. You could name others as well, who always appear on the same committees, always seem to be in lockstep and make decisions that seem to favour the organisation. He doesn't like conflict. He doesn't like too much debate, at least public debate, about decision making and direction. And that's how things have been. Very much an old school character, it seems. And you mentioned the ethics inquiries or lack of them. You mentioned Tokyo there. I mean, who knows much about the IOC's ethics committee? How it derives decisions? It says very little. It often says we are monitoring developments. This matter is subject to legal action, name the jurisdiction. So we are waiting, and then nothing kind of happens. And then if something was going to happen, it happens in a murky way where often people do this thing called self-suspend themselves. And then a decision doesn't need to be taken by the IOC. Again, you've got to give FIFA some credit here, I guess. We talked about that their ethics decisions might be quirky and like hard to understand, but at least they're published. We can read them. You couldn't say anything like that about the IOC, and I don't think their ethics head Paqueret Zappelli, who's been there for years, rarely, if ever, it speaks to the media.
No, that's right, Tariq. It's in fact one of the guy who was known as the Kingmaker, Sheikh Ahmad from Kuwait, who lots of people credited with helping Bach get to be IOC president. Interestingly, he is due to have a court case in Switzerland this week, which might have been potentially embarrassing for Bach's re-election. If something had happened about with him and with one of his main supporters, but that has been put back until after the election because one of the defendants came forward without any legal representation, so it had to be adjourned. That is a classic case of where the ethics committee have said they're looking into things, the ethics board of the IOC, but nothing has ever emerged from it.
Some people who might be irritated with Thomas Bach this week are the PRs and consultants who suddenly have been denied a lot of business with the 2032 games being carved out for Brisbane. And of course, they're returning to Australia, the games, only 32 years after they were held in Sydney. Does that mean perhaps there's some hope of the Olympics returning to the UK soon, despite only hosting them in London in 2012?
2040 Olympics coming to London, isn't it?
after the 2030 World Cup and then the Euros this year, right, Ziggs?
That's the headline.
Well, actually, I may be joking, but actually, the UK sport is looking at a long-term bid for the Olympics again, in a very general sort of way. And I think they are talking about 2040. It's ridiculous that we're looking so far ahead, but there we are.
Is it fair for the UK to get it again before other countries have even had a chance to? Other continents have not necessarily hosted the Olympics. The fact we've still not had a Middle East Games, we've still not had an African Games, and these are games that have been running since 1896 now. Would we feel comfortable? Or should they move on to just taking it to the most logical and easiest place to stage it, rather than it being about sharing it around countries or around the continent?
Rob. Yes, in a word, yes. The cost of these things are astronomical. It's such a waste of money. We're talking about billions of dollars. There aren't very many countries who could justifiably afford these events, and they're getting more and more expensive at every turn. I know the IOC is talking about revamps, etc. But, if you are a developing country, and even if you're a developed country, there's so much more relevant infrastructure you might want to be spending your money on that will be for the greater good than hosting a 2-week party. Although, London 2012, being from Britain, from London, it was great and a lot of fun. But, we're talking about billions of dollars, and in Britain's case, billions of pounds. that's gone into this jamboree, etc. I think the people who say, maybe you have 4 or 5 fixed host cities and it rotates around this. You take it around the world still, but you don't have to keep having these astronomical costs of hosting games, and these are costs that is largely met by the public purse. The IOC has these demands, etc. Hardly puts its hands in its own pocket, and then moves on. I think the time has come to rethink these events. Tokyo is already about 200% over budget.
Yeah, interesting point. There's been more things coming out this week about the 2022 Olympics in Beijing, and the leader of the Liberal Democrats has called on the government to boycott those games. Who is the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Tariq?
No idea.
Rob?
It's Ed Davey, because I actually have a clip lined up and we can now hear from what he asked Boris Johnson in Prime Minister's questions about the 2022 Olympic. Beijing will be the first to stage both the Summer and Winter Games.
Today, millions of Uyghur people in China live in fear under a cruel regime. The BBC, international media and human rights NGOs are all reporting on forced labour camps, women being raped and sterilised, and families being separated. This is a genocide happening in front of our eyes. So does the Prime Minister agree with me that unless China ends this genocide, Britain and Team GB should boycott the Winter Olympics in Beijing next year?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman is absolutely right to highlight the appalling campaign against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and that's why the Foreign Secretary, my honourable Foreign Secretary, has set out the policies that he has, the package of measures to ensure that no British companies are complicit in or profiting from violations. We're leading international action in the UN to hold China to account, and we'll continue to work with the US, friends and partners around the world to do just that. He raises a point about a sporting boycott. We're not normally in favour of sporting boycotts in this country, Mr. Speaker, and that's been the long-standing position of this government.
Over in the United States, though, this week, the White House kept the door open to a potential boycott of the Beijing Olympics. Here's what happened when President Joe Biden's press secretary, Jen Psaki, was asked about whether or not Team USA should boycott those Olympics next year over China's repression of the Uyghurs.
Republicans on the Hill, and including Nikki Haley, the former US ambassador to the UN, are urging President Biden to not to participate in Chinese Winter Olympics. Has the president taken a decision on that?
There hasn't been a final decision made on that, and of course we would look for guidance from the U.S. Olympic Committee.
So what do we make of those transatlantic differences? The White House not ruling out a boycott, but Boris Johnson firmly against some government order for athletes not to go to China.
No surprise, really. I don't think that Boris Johnson came out saying that. It's lots of. I think generally, although the Thatcher government was in favour of the Moscow Olympic boycott, I think the successive governments since then, of whatever colour, have always shied away from boycotting Olympics. So that's not a big surprise. I was just remembering actually when Boris Johnson went to Beijing for the 2008 Games, and he arrived I think a couple of days after it started, and there's a press conference, and he was saying what would he have done differently about the opening ceremony for London, with London in 4 years' time. And he thought for a bit, and he was talking, and then he thought about the scandal about the girl at the opening ceremony who was miming the singing because the other one had dropped because her teeth were crooked. So she said, he said, "Oh, I wouldn't have done the big switcheroo with a girl with the buck teeth."
Wasn't he also going on about whiff waff as well?
That was his. Yeah, that's right. We invented whiff waff. Not the Chinese, it was the English who invented ping pong, but he called it whiff waff. It was the start. It was that to me was the start of his pathway to where he is now at number 10.
But he's not at a sports stadium named after him yet.
No, which is all the rage, certainly in India. 100,000 seat stadium in Ahmedabad, where the shortest test match in living memory is just played. England beaten by India inside 2 days at the newly named Narendra Modi Stadium. The Indian Prime Minister, who's actually from Gujarat, decided to name the stadium after himself, which really raised some eyebrows. I guess it's he's a bit of a show-off, and I guess if you've got a massive, spanking new, shiny stadium, and you've got a test match with England, why not name the stadium after yourself if you like that sort of thing? In India, there are many arenas and buildings named after prime ministers and former leaders, etc. But that normally happens after they've left office, and it's an honour that's bestowed on them. But this guy seems to like to celebrate himself whenever the opportunity arises, and he's got this particular style of leadership, almost similar to the Gulf monarchs in some way, where you build new, tallest, shiniest things, and stand there and collect the acclaim. Perhaps it's the sign of our times where we celebrate the self more than we've ever done before. He's also quite a prolific tweeter.
Did pick up you did say that in living memory, but we might have some listeners who are around in 1935 for the last. Is that the previous shortest test match?
Yeah, that's right. The TV rights there, Channel 4. How do you think they've done? Obviously, they've had the last 2 tests have finished very early. How disappointing would that be, given that there was so much fanfare made about them actually getting these games?
Well, I think especially this most recent one, because this was the time zone where it was going to be most attractive to viewers, wasn't it? Instead of having the 4 a.m. start, now actually people could get up at a decent hour and watch the cricket all the way through. But yeah, as you say, it was short-lived, and there's bound to be some disappointment in terms of that, because Channel 4 will have been hoping to have their fixtures schedule packed for double that length of time. So it's one of those things with cricket, isn't it? I mean, I think it's going to be a long time before it comes a test series back onto terrestrial TV, perhaps. The Cricket Australia have got the tender out for the Ashes at the moment. That's a 5-year tender. Looks like Sky and BT Sport will go head-to-head for that. There's even suggestions that Cricket Australia might test the water with a 10-year deal, but I think that seems unlikely unless they get a really, really good offer for that. But I think with the climate as it is, I think 5 years is more likely.
Well, talking of time spans, there's been a big winner this week following FIFA's decision 3 years ago to place a 10-year limit on prosecuting bribery cases. The investigation into Franz Beckenbauer has been dropped. The World Cup winning captain and coach was subject to an ethics probe along with fellow Germans behind their country's staging of the 2006 World Cup. The investigations began after a report more than 5 years ago in Der Spiegel magazine claimed the bid had a slush fund of almost €7 million to buy votes. So, what do we make of the collapse of this high-profile investigation?
There's a great tweet from your colleague Graham Dunbar, I thought, on this, Rob, where he said FIFA drops the ethics case against Franz Beckenbauer because a statute of limitations for bribery had expired. It had expired because FIFA decided in 2018 to time limit bribery prosecutions. Effectively, it prevented itself from dealing with this case. I mean, the cynic in you might suggest that this is so they don't have to wash some more dirty linen in public.
And FIFA were really irritated when I wrote the story in 2018, which revealed they'd suddenly changed the ethics code to impose this time limit. It seemed highly questionable why it was in place, given how hard it is to prosecute these cases, and it can take a long time to uncover wrongdoing. They went and put a whole statement out expressing problems with the report, even though it was fully accurate, just comparing one version of the ethics code with the old one, which showed they'd suddenly inserted this new time limit. They also removed the word corruption from the ethics code. They said that wasn't significant at the time, but then later on they restored corruption to the ethics code.
Yeah, they published the written reasons as well, and they were scathing about the conduct of these guys. So they've done a full investigation and found that they probably did do all these things that they've alleged to have done, but we can't do anything about it. Begs the question, if you knew there is a time limit, what the hell was the point of doing that entire investigation as well? That all costs money. If you know you're not going to be able to sanction them, why do it? It just seems like a verdict that might suit all parties here. FIFA get to say, oh, look, we've done a thorough investigation, we're new, we're shiny, we take these things seriously, and we found these people who've done X, Y, and Z. On the other hand, these guys get away with it, and the whole world moves on again. It just seems a bit of a farce, doesn't it?
And even more so because his lawyers told FIFA last year that Beckenbauer wasn't in a position to participate in lengthy oral questioning or any proceedings. But then FIFA, even they realised the fact, actually, what was Beckenbauer doing? Attending public events and giving interviews last year to celebrate 30 years since he managed West Germany to victory in the 1990 World Cup. And, they even point out he didn't appear to have any memory problems when it came to looking back on old football matches. But amazingly, thinking back to the bid, it'd be too hard for him to deliver any recollections.
Yeah, we've all done a lot of work in the last 15 years on FIFA and its problems with transparency and corruption and deals, etc., etc. And there's been lots of crooks involved in that, lots of people who've been involved in mismanagement, and lots of people who've got these outstanding allegations against them. And Franz Beckenbauer is one of those. And actually, he's got some really serious allegations against him. I'm sure there's been massive delaying tactics so that he actually doesn't have to answer any questions. But he's somebody whose reputation has definitely been sullied by his involvement in these affairs.
One of the reasons they said Franz Beckenbauer couldn't participate in the hearings or speak to FIFA's investigators was because he had some issues with his mind. He got essentially a medical note saying he was suffering from a disease of the mind and wasn't in a fit state to participate. However, FIFA's investigators pointed out a number of occasions where Beckenbauer was fully cognizant. He participated in a ceremony celebrating, I think, the 1970 World Cup, all sorts of other public gatherings. They were wondering, well, if he's fit enough and lucid enough to speak at all manner of events, could he not have called in or done a Zoom for half an hour to explain his actions? And that's how we leave it. Another unsatisfactory ending for another football investigation. I guess people are just not going to be surprised anymore. And when you're an organisation that's trying to, turn over a new leaf and say we're different, everything's clean, there's process, etc., these things really are a hammer blow. Every few weeks there's another one of these.
And a lack of clarity, really, from the FIFA ethics side in terms of us being able to question them publicly. Ever since, really, we had the big blow-up in Bahrain at the FIFA Congress in 2017 when, effectively, the judge Eckhart and the investigator Borbely were ousted.
Yes, the blow-up in Bahrain. That was a bizarre situation, wasn't it? To be fair, they played to the gallery a bit. Those two guys as well. Particularly the investigator Borbely. He was kind of promoted after Michael Garcia, the former United States attorney, walked away from FIFA, saying these people aren't serious about ethics. Borbely stepped up and did quite well for himself from the back of it, and they were going to be replaced. They knew they were going to be replaced, but decided to fly to Bahrain and hold this press conference for the aforementioned blow up in Bahrain. But it is FIFA land, and all these sort of crazy things happen on a semi-regular basis, I guess.
And just now, Gianni Infantino is marking 5 years as FIFA president, something that we hope to look at in more depth in a future show. So if you've got any questions about his reign or any thoughts about how he's done as FIFA president, you can tweet us at Sport Unlocked or email sportunlockpod@gmail.com. Well, that's all we have time for on episode 6 of Sport Unlocked. Thanks again for listening, and enjoy your sports viewing in the days ahead. Goodbye for now.